It always seems simple, but we always kind of start with the origins of the food that we are talking about. And like a classic taproom tastings, the origins of coffee are unclear and covered with lore. Um, I saw a few different, I know you saw different ones than I did. So between me and Catherine, there was like 4 or 5 different origin stories of how the coffee bean was discovered, found, cultivated. But the one that I found, it originated in Ethiopia. I think that's kind of the most accepted one. Yeah, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
Um,
crazy.
it was a goat herder named Haldi discovered what we know today as the coffee bean. One version of that legend says that he discovered it after he noticed that the goats were eating the beans off a certain tree, and they got so energetic they didn't want to sleep at night. So he investigated further to see what they were eating, how they were eating it, if they were okay with it, if they were getting sick from it. He The second part, I'm not too sure about, but I did see this on a few different sources. The findings were brought to the local monastery, and the drink was made using the berries from the coffee bean because it made everybody awake um, during their long hours of evening prayer, um, which sounds true. I mean,
Yeah,
the amount of coffee that we ingest to stay up is the same amount.
yeah, I think that was what I discovered. Similar to what I found is that
Mhm.
coffee really spread because it was being used by um, Islamic, the dervishes in um, Egypt and other Islamic places, to keep them awake for like their midnight and early morning um,
Mhm.
prayers. And so at the very beginning, coffee was very much like a religious drink and associated with Islam. I know there were a couple of myths about Muhammad having coffee and knowing coffee, but I do think like the sort of more accepted date of coffee being drunk is after Muhammad. It's about
Mhm.
1000 AD, I think, um, is the date I saw. Um, but I think to go back a little bit, coffee and what we use to make coffee, the drink, is actually the seed of the coffee plant, which it's basically
Mhm.
a tree, and it has these little like cherry red fruits that grow on the tree, and then within that there's like this meat um, kind of stuff, and
I have a little
then the
photo to
bean.
show everybody.
Oh,
There.
great!
A
Yeah,
good visual.
yeah. So the first coffee consumption was people were just like eating the the cherry, the coffee
The red
fruit.
the red one that you see on
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
And then they realized they can like get the bean out and then roasting it and all that. And but coffee, so from Ethiopia, it kind of goes across the um, Red Sea to Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula, and then the the Arabs really kind of clamped down on the spread for a long time, and they have like a monopoly over um, coffee and the coffee trade because in the roasting process, the seeds can no longer germinate, and so they can ship it all over without worrying that anybody's going to grow their own coffee plants.
Which the Dutch did, as we learned. But you can see here, this is what's called the coffee belt today, which is where primarily all of the coffee that we ingest today is from, where it's grown best. I don't think I've had coffee from some of these areas. And the more that I learned about where everything comes from, the more I'm going to start looking a little closer at labels and where they're coming from. Because normally I look at the notes. But going back to roasting the seeds and stopping that germinating process, um, the 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 Dutch and me and Catherine spoke a little bit about this because it sounded so outrageous but we knew that it was true. The Dutch were really dedicated to the concept of stealing unroasted beans in order to cultivate their own, to start their own colonies, to start entering the trading of coffee. So the Ethiopian and a lot of the roasters from Yemen were very strict on how it left their communities. They were very, very strict. They made sure everything was roasted. Nobody was allowed to leave with any raw beans of any kind. There were instances that we found where the Dutch sent in an officer to sneak in to steal beans to to steal them. And it sounds so crazy, but it's just one of those. We were sharing sources back and forth, and I was like, oh my goodness, I thought this was a fake, like a fake, like it sounded like a legend almost. But they literally went in, stole those beans, and then started colonizing areas. I think they were starting to go around. Do you remember? It's leaving my brain. Oh, to
Um,
Java. They went to Java and they
yeah,
started roasting the beans that they took from Yemen into the area around Java. And they started to mix those beans together so that they started to create their own new strains of coffee beans. Which really, again, if we've learned anything from foodways, everything travels, everything begins to mix, and we start to get new um, notes, coffees, and on top of the new processes of roasting and stuff. It was very interesting.
yeah. I heard there's a couple of different myths about how coffee kind of escaped this Ethiopia, Yemen kind of enclave. And one was like the Dutch were able to sneak out seedlings or seeds and plant them on their colonies in Indonesia. But then I also found this one story of a Indian Sufi who snuck seeds out of Yemen by like basically taping them to his chest.
Ooh,
Um, and so he like tapes these seeds to his chest, and then is able to like sneak out of Yemen. And that's how Indian coffee, how coffee got to India. Um,
also believable.
exactly. Yeah, and the kind of espionage doesn't stop there, right? Once the Europeans have coffee, and like the Dutch have coffee, um, it doesn't stop there because the French and the English both want coffee as well. They want their own um, plants. They don't want to have to rely on the Dutch. And so I think there was like one seedling that was taken to the Netherlands, and it was like at the Royal Physicians, Society or whatever. And so there was all these biologists and botanists who were sent almost not undercover because they were just like going to Amsterdam, but they were trying to like steal clippings of this seedling.
I
And
believe you.
yeah, so and it's from those seedlings, those clippings, that a lot of the um, American coffee plants derive from. And so basically, all of the coffee that's grown in Central and South America basically come from like one or two coffee plants.
It's worth noting that through all of this espionage to get their coffee beans, when coffee was finally introduced to Europe originally, it was not well accepted. Um, there was one instance in 1610. The direct quote was, this man had tried coffee for the first time and he found it black as soot and tasting not much unlike it. There was a lot of hysteria around the introduction of coffee in the early 1600s, when people started to have it in their cities and stuff. Do you want to tell the story about the Pope?
Sure.
It's a good
So
one.
yeah, so coffee, since it comes from um, the Arab, the Middle East, it was associated with Islam and the quote unquote infidels. Um, And so when it was first introduced into Christian Europe, there was some concerns about it. And so some Catholic um, priests, I believe, brought it up to the Pope at the time, and this was in the 15 late 1500s. Pope
Hmm.
Clement something. I didn't write down the number. Um, and they're talking about this drink that's sort of becoming popular throughout Western Europe, and they're saying you have to do something, you have to like ban it. And so the Pope is like, well, let me try this, you know, drink first. And so somebody brought him a cup of coffee, and he tasted it, and he was like, this is great. Um, and but coffee had been called Satan's juice at the time. Like they're trying to like talk about it,
Villainize it. Yeah.
villainize it. Yeah. And so the Pope basically says that, you know, this Satan's juice is so great, we're gonna baptize it and make it a Christian drink. Um, but after that, it kind of like made it permissible, really to drink coffee in Western Europe. While at the same time, a lot of the sultans and the people in power in the Arabian Peninsula were trying to ban coffee because, and we'll talk about this a little later, the coffee houses were all places of like revolution and political intrigue and
Free thinking.
free thinking. So just as coffee is being approved by the Pope, it is now becoming uh, haram in Islam.
I think for us, the 1600s, the late 1500s, early 1600s, when you can see coffee starting to spread through Europe and seeing the reactions was one of our favorite things to look at. I was looking up medicinal properties of coffee at the time, and I stumbled over the incident with the Swedish king Gustav III, who decided to do a medical experiment with coffee because he was convinced that it was really bad and he didn't want the people of Sweden to drink coffee. Um, he found a set of twin brothers who had been jailed for murders, and they were sentenced to death. So he used them as kind of like an experiment. He gave them both the same amount of coffee and tea every single day at the same time, and they were to ingest the same amount every single day to see any health benefits, if somebody would get sick, who would die first. A general experiment, a living experiment to show the people that coffee was bad and that he was right. Ironically enough, he's assassinated in the middle of this. And the brothers would go on to live very healthy lives, both of them, both coffee and tea ingesting. And they died of natural causes in their 80s. My favorite part was the brother who was ingesting the tea every day died first. So coffee is not that bad. Uh, this was this was part of me looking into actual scientifically backed ones, because I was like, okay, the 18th century ones are always like, it'll cure your gout, it'll make you better, everything is fine and everything is awesome. But I was like, well, scientifically, we've learned some stuff about coffee. John Hopkins, their list was interesting. There was one that I wanted to point out. There was a study done that says your DNA will be stronger if you drink coffee, and I was very on top of that one. It said dark roast coffees decrease the breakage in your DNA strands, which could stop tumors from growing, on top of many other weird health benefits. So me and Kathleen learned that we're both very large coffee drinkers, so I think we're healthy.
Yeah.
I will take it. Yeah, no, the King of Sweden story is probably one of the more favorite things that I've discovered while doing research for Taproom Tastings.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of, I guess, spurious claims about what coffee could do. Um, because as coffee is introduced into Europe, it's introduced around the same time as chocolate and tea. So like these three drinks are really competing to kind of get a foothold in Europe. Um, and because coffee is so bitter, especially when you don't prepare it right, um, it it kind of caught on as a medicine, right? Medicine is not supposed to taste good, and so this drink is must be a medicine. And in fact, the first person to open a coffee house in London, a Greek man, he actually distributed a pamphlet that would like that listed all the medicinal benefits of coffee as kind of a marketing scheme, right? He's distributing, saying, "Come to my coffee house and drink my coffee, and you'll have all of these great things happen to you." And so it claims to be able to cure things like rheumatism, dropsy, scurvy, jaundice, gout. It was even suggested for the plague. Um, there's one suggestion that it will help prevent worms in children, and that if a woman drinks coffee while she's pregnant, then the baby will not get worms within its first year of life.
Okay.
So, and then they also claim, it's a cure for drunkenness and headache, which some of those things um, are
Yeah.
true. Um,
Yeah.
and um, what else is it? I saw there was one. It defends from pestilential infection. So just like general, basically, you drink coffee, you're not going to get sick. Um,
The same thing today. That was basically the list put out by the official doctors.
yeah, yeah.
You,
Uh,
you know, less heart failure,
but there
cure your
were
liver.
there were people who were very much against coffee,
Hmm.
and um, so they had all the reasons why, all the ailments that coffee was going to habitual coffee drinking was going to cause. And one of the biggest ones I found was impotence. Um, and there's one um, writer, I think he was Dutch, named Simon Pauly, who wrote a treatise on coffee, tea, and chocolate, and tobacco. He hated all of it.
No fun.
But his whole section on coffee is just how it is going to sterilize everybody, and that the reason the Persians can be so promiscuous but not have so many children is because they drink so much coffee. Um, which this was written in the 1660s. Um, but there were other doctors and learned men who claimed that coffee was uh, caused impotence and flatulence and all sorts of um, things
All
like
the
that.
all the stuff.
Yeah.
All
Uh,
the stuff. But I mean, it catches on, right? I mean, coffee is one of our biggest industries, and even into the 18th century, it was coffee, tea, and chocolate were the three big imports. Those were the three big luxuries that you had in the colonies. Um, which led us into the discussion. And one of the points that we wanted to try and look into was, when did coffee become this kind of official beverage? I mean, we looked at the revolution and we looked at the Tea Act. Um, I'm still 50-50 on if the Tea Act really like pushed coffee into the American drink that we know today of tea bad, tea British, coffee patriotism. Um, just because they were just like, well, we're not going to drink British tea. They started drinking smuggled Dutch tea. They started drinking American grown tea, and they drink coffee, but I don't think it was like, it's not to the extent that you would think it would be immediately like pushed. Um, I have, I know Samuel Adams wrote to Abigail Adams about drinking coffee and how important it was to show your patriotism, but I don't think it was that readily available that it could have been used. We couldn't brew coffee in the home, essentially, right? For a very long time. It was a very public space, public coffee house kind of a drink.
yeah, the the revolution and the tea boycotts did have something to do with, were one cause of the increase in coffee consumption in the colonies, in what would become the United States. But after the revolution, tea consumption goes kind of back up, uh, maybe not to pre-revolutionary levels, but it still goes back up. And I think really the split, what I found was the split where it was like tea British, coffee American, actually came in World War II, um,
Hmm.
when the rationing, especially in Britain, they just could not get coffee, and so that like completely took coffee out of people's diets essentially. And then after the war, it just didn't come back. And so really that's when the full split happens. Because I think in the United States, even though we think of ourselves as like a coffee drinking culture, uh, tea is still huge here. So
Still very dominant.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
but I did find a number uh, that says coffee consumption increased from uh, 1/5 of a pound per person in 1772, so per person per year, to 1.4 pounds per person per year in 1799. Uh,
Okay.
so it definitely increased uh,
Okay.
a- a- with the boycotts.
It goes
And
up and down too. I know that the War of 1812, he took another hit because of patriotism. But it goes up but yeah, World War II makes the most amount of sense.
yeah, um, and there were other things like War of 1812. Um, Coffee also took a bit of a hit because the port of New Orleans was blockaded,
Hmm.
and New Orleans was is still, I think, the second largest port for importing coffee in the United States. Uh, so I think that, and then again, the Civil War blockades, so coffee consumption had to drop, and tea as well. So um, various
There
things
were
like that.
also poor crops at the time as well. I think it was turn of the 19th century. A lot of the crops, there was a fungus that infected a lot of the coffee beans, and they were completely, I mean, destroyed. So there was a lack of coffee production to begin with to even be shipped out for people to take. Um, it's a rough time. I'm glad I didn't live during that time. I
Yeah.
could say that as a historian, right?
So actually, one of the things that interested me was like these periods of coffee scarcity. Like, what did people do? Obviously, you could turn to tea or something else, but today we have so many like mock coffees or coffee alternatives. Um, and so I was trying to see like what was available in the 18th century if you couldn't get coffee, because again, coffee does not grow in the United States. You have to import it here. um, and
Washington tried.
the one I'm most familiar with is chicory root, which is actually native. I didn't know this. It's native to like Germany and France, and Western Europe. And so actually the Germans were one of the first to roast chicory root as a coffee substitute. And you roast it really dark, grind it up, and it's pretty similar to coffee in taste. And then the French kind of adopted that. The French love their coffee, and they did a
Hmm.
lot for coffee culture. Um, but the French took on that chicory root as well, and so that kind of went with French immigrants into um, and French colonists into the New World. And so, like New Orleans coffee is kind of the most famous for having chicory root mixed in, and that was something that happened during uh, the War of 1812 when the port was blockaded, and so they could stretch their coffee supply by mixing in chicory root. And I did learn that there was a um, chicory farm in Queens, all the way. It was planted in like the early 20th century, and then it was finally like ripped up right after World War II. Uh,
Did it grow anything? Was it
yeah, they
successful?
grew like lots of chicory.
Oh
Um,
my goodness, I had no idea.
yeah, so um,
Cool.
yeah, and then so that was like one of the artificial or coffee alternatives, but I did find in my new favorite cookbook, The Country Housewife's Family Companion from 1750, there is a recipe for making artificial coffee. And so,
Oh, good.
so you can see here, we have artificial coffee. There's actually two ways that he suggests you make it. One is to burn bread and scrape off the burnt powder. And he claims it will have a taste very near true coffee. But the other way you can do it is you use wheat berries, which is just unhulled wheat. And you would treat it essentially the same way you treat coffee beans. You roast them, you grind it, and then you infuse it. And he does suggest that if you pour this wheat berry coffee over 1 or 2 egg yolks with sugar, it drinks like chocolate, like hot chocolate. So I don't know. I don't think I'm going to be trying either of these.
Are
But
you sure?
maybe the wheat berries. I've had burnt bread before, and I don't quite see how it could be taste near true coffee. So don't
You
know.
know, we have all these conversations about pumpkin spice lattes and all of these holiday drinks, but it could be so much worse that Starbucks could be offering us red coffee. Um, I'm so glad that you didn't try that. But you do behind you have a bunch of beautiful pieces from the Keeler Tavern collection if you'd like to show, because I
Sure.
got to see some of them earlier in the week and they were beautiful.
Yeah, we have a couple of pieces from the collection here. We don't have much coffee paraphernalia. Um, One thing we do have that I can hold on, it's at my feet here, is a coffee bean roaster. So it's got a long handle on the end, because up until like the 1870s, you really could not get free roasted coffee beans. You bought green coffee beans, they were dried, but they were still green, and you roasted them in your house because there was no way to package them properly to keep them fresh. And so this barrel roaster, is one of the ways that you could do it, because when you're roasting coffee beans, you have to keep it moving. Um, yeah, Mary, you have some of the other paraphernalia there.
Thought I'd
Otherwise,
fill in the gaps.
yeah, if you don't have a barrel roaster like this one, you could just use a frying pan, or like this one pictured, the coffee
Number
roasting pan
4.
from Mount Vernon.
Yeah. I noticed when I was looking at the growth of the tools that you would use, there was a big push around temperance, the temperance movement. There were a lot of people who were part of the temperance movement who wanted to kind of push away the intake of alcohol, and they were pushing to update and make coffee more accessible at home. Um, and there was one man I forgot his name, but he patented this like at home commercial grade coffee bean roaster so that you can make it at home, save your money, so you wouldn't have to go out and drink liquor. So it's interesting to see over the span of the 300 years that we were looking at who was pushing coffee and who wasn't for what reasons. Um, I was, I
Yeah.
don't know. I say this with like my dinky percolator at home of everybody's got fancy coffee cups and where it came from. And I'm just like, okay.
Yeah. Um, well, the thing about the temperance, I do know that like Scandinavian countries, Norway and Sweden, they're some of the highest, they drink like the most amount of coffee per person, because alcohol was illegal in those places for a very long time. And so they have a really big coffee culture in
Well,
those places.
the king of Sweden was wrong, remember?
Yes,
It makes sense
too.
now.
That too, yeah. Uh, but I think that's one of the things is there's a number of treatises on coffee that were published throughout the sixth or 17th and 18th century, where people are arguing about the best way to make coffee, right? There's all these
Mhm.
different methods of doing it, and how dark you roast it, and what kind of pot you're using to roast your beans, and what kind of pot are you using to make your coffee. Do you boil the coffee? Do you infuse it? Do you know, do X, Y, or Z? Do you get your coffee from Mocha or Java or Martinique or wherever? So, which, is something that you hear today too, especially among
Today.
the
Yeah.
coffee aficionados. So,
If everybody
more
wants to
things
let us
change.
know, yeah, if anybody wants to let us know what their favorite kind of coffee is or drink or I'm always interested. I always like a good new suggestion.
Yeah. So
Don't
some
give
of the
Starbucks any ideas.
other things, speaking of pots for making coffee, I do have two coffee pots here. These are both pewter, which was not a recommended material. Um, Silver or stone is the recommended material for coffee pots. Um, but these are kind of the standard, and you'll notice they're like a lot taller and skinnier than teapots. And um, that's because they emulate kind of the Turkish coffee pots, and the pots that were used by the Arabic um, nations, cultures who introduced coffee, whereas teapots look like Chinese teapots. And it's actually the same thing with the cups you use. So teacups are kind of wider and more bowl shaped, whereas coffee cups, I have one here, are kind of taller and skinnier. Um, some of that is just emulating where these drinks came from, but also it's like the temperature thing. Tea, you're using boiling water, and so you want it to cool down more quickly. Whereas coffee, generally, you're not quite at boiling, and you want to drink it really hot. And so the taller, narrow uh, shape kind of keeps it uh, from doing that. And Barbara asked, why not pewter but silver and stone? So silver and stone were considered like inert or neutral. They're not going to impart flavor to whatever you're drinking or making in it. Whereas pewter, which is tin based, so it's really tin and copper were not recommended, because they would react to the heat and like impart some of the metallic flavor, I guess. Which was interesting to me because I think a lot of um, Turkish and like North African coffee, they're made in copper pots. So that's something. I mean, it could just be um, don't do
Coincidence?
it the way that the
Oh,
uncivilized,
oh my
those
goodness.
people do it. So, um, but the reasoning was apparently it was going to make your coffee taste bad.
Everybody's got their own way. It's what I've learned about when we've done coffee, when we've done tea, and the arguments behind the amount of milk and sugar you're allowed to put into some of these beverages. It is a personal choice, people.
Yeah,
Do what makes you happy. I drink my coffee black. My husband does like this much milk, this much coffee. We've learned to live with each other. It's okay. It's all
yeah.
right.
I did find, looking through recipe books, very few books had instructions to make coffee. It's one of these things you find in um, old recipe books, like they assume you're at a certain level of knowledge.
Mhm.
But I did find there are two books that have um, that included recipes. One was that the Country Housewife's Family Companion, and they talk about how to first roast your coffee beans and then how to make it. And then the New System of Domestic Cookery, which by Maria Rendell from 1808. These are both English cookbooks. Um, and one thing I did notice from Maria Rendell's, you're taking, it's 2 ounces of coffee to about 8 um, cups of water, which would create a very weak coffee. Um,
Hmm.
Today, I don't know exactly we're like 1 to 1.5 ounces to every 2 cups of water or something like that. I don't know exactly. I should look that up. So that's one thing that I noticed is like it's really weak coffee that they're recommending, even though they call it strong coffee. Um, like in this last paragraph she says, if for foreigners or those who like it extremely strong, make only 8 dishes from 3 ounces. So that's your strong coffee. And the one thing I kind of stuck on is that if for foreigners, because it was commented on
Yes.
by a traveler in the new United States that Americans drink very, very weak coffee. um, I can't remember the traveler's name. I'm pretty sure he was French. Um, so
Oh
again, the
no.
French being coffee snobs. But he was kind of commenting on the fact that Americans drank really weak coffee, and I think the British. This is from the English heritage of um, coffee, as you know, Maria Rendell is a British cookbook, um, which makes a line that I found in a treatise called The Domestic Coffee Man make more sense, because the Domestic Coffee Man, who's from London, uh, recommends that you drink coffee 2 or 3 times a day, once first thing in the morning, once at 4 in the afternoon, and then the last cup at 9 o'clock at night. So in my house, we actually do drink coffee late at night. It hasn't, it doesn't really affect us, I guess. But um, for most people, I do think I've been told that it's not the norm, as Mary tells me. And so if you're making really weak coffee, I guess it makes more sense. Um, but coffee doesn't really show up in many recipes. I did find a couple, most of them for like coffee milk, um, because normally you would drink coffee black, but if you wanted coffee milk, you actually steep your coffee grounds in the milk. Um, but I did find from this French cookbook called The Professed Cook, he had a bunch of different coffee recipes for making like coffee wafers and coffee ice cream. But he also had these coffee eggs, where you mix coffee with some egg yolks, and then it makes like, and you bake it, and it makes like a coffee pudding. James Jazz Townsend and Sons, on their YouTube page, they tried this. Um, Apparently, the guy thought it was pretty good. It's basically coffee custard with no milk, and a lot of sugar. So, um,
There's
but
always a recipe that you can make with an egg if I've learned anything from the years we've been doing this.
yeah, but otherwise, coffee is just, you drink, coffee's for drinking.
That's it. That's it. I know we were looking at recipes and we were like, I wonder when that starts to happen. And I didn't see anything. I mean, I think of like a coffee cake or a coffee pudding or something like that, even like coffee ice cream and stuff, but that doesn't start for a while. Just I think out of just availability, right? Because then it's not until that shift in World War II, after when they lift off the rations, that everybody has access to things. And that's when you start to see Jello salads and in the 60s and the 70s as they rise up. And the way that we start experimenting with food in this country will always amaze me. Jello molds are top on the list for an episode one day, possibly.
Yeah. So I think the one thing we haven't really talked about is coffee houses,
Yeah, let's do
which
coffee
is
houses.
really interesting, because coffee was like chocolate, was a drink that you had in public spaces, mostly because it just takes a while. If you have to roast your beans and then grind them and then prepare your coffee, you need to have either the servants to do it for you or the time to do it. And so it became this thing in Europe and then later in the United States where it was a thing that you did outside of the house. Tea was your private home drink, and coffee and chocolate were sort of outside of the home drinks. And so, starting in the 1650s, coffee houses started popping up all over England, um, and uh, and then by the 1700s, they were starting to show up in the United States as well. But coffee house culture, I thought, was super interesting. Um, in the UK, or England, Great Britain, as it was, they became known as penny universities because they were places of like intellect and discussion, and so basically anyone could go to a coffee house, and for the price of a cup of coffee, which was a penny, they could join into these conversations. And so coffee houses became this like kind of place where everybody in society sort of became equal. You could have discussions on politics and science and all sorts of things. Not religion, though. You weren't supposed to be talking about religion in the coffee house. Um, and Yeah, so I thought that was they were called penny universities. Um, but once you allow people to start gathering and chatting and talking, they start thinking of revolution.
Who
Um,
knew? It's like it's a pattern or something.
yeah. And so this was common in pretty much coffee houses. Wherever there were coffee houses, the people in power eventually tried to shut them down,
Mhm.
because they heard that they were trying, there were plots and stuff happening inside these coffee houses. Um, and so I think it's the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston.
Mhm.
Daniel Webster called it the headquarters of the revolution because this was where the Sons of Liberty met. Paul Revere was waiting in the Green Dragon Tavern, which was technically a coffee house. Um, Paul Revere was there on the night of his midnight ride and things like that. So,
They're
but
totally different from taverns. Absolutely, completely. There's no overlap whatsoever. Um, no. Uh, I think that's also what we were trying to figure out was that kind of difference between a coffee house and a tavern and their roles. And we kind of realized between Connecticut and Philly and Boston and New York City that the coffee houses had their own specific role that met the needs of the community, essentially. Where in Boston, that the Green Dragon Tavern was this place for revolution, and that's where people went. And in New York City, all of the coffee houses had this very like focus on merchants. And these were merchant headquarters, and I kind of describe them almost like a WeWork station where they were these places where merchants would set their headquarters. They didn't get proper offices or storefronts or anything. They would have subscriptions to these coffee houses. They would go in and be like, well, if you want to meet with me, you're going to meet with me here. It's where they would get their food. It's where they would get their mail. They would have these meetings, and they would go off. And many a times the coffee houses in New York City were overlooking the dock. So as close as you can get, they would have these outdoor balconies with telescopes set up so you could go see when your shipments were coming in, if they were coming into the harbor, so you knew to go down to go see them. There were two mostly famous ones. Let me share my screen. I found images. I was very proud of that one. So here is the King's Arm Tavern, which is one of the earliest ones that was only operational for about a year. You can see it. I mean, it looks like a house. It's very tiny. It's very quaint. This one was located not in the harbor area. This one was located up by Trinity Church. So today, if you're walking by where Water Street is, if you walk all the way up Broadway, you're looking at like a 15-minute walk. A little bit out of the way, but still you were on Broadway, huge giant road for trade, economics, all that fun stuff. The most famous one is probably the Totine Coffee House, which was on Water and Wall Street. And this was one of the more exclusive ones, your subscriptions you would buy into, and this became the original New York Stock Exchange. So all of those subscriptions were very, very important people. I have my list here. So original shareholders included John Jacob Astor, William Baird, Anthony Bleecker, John Peter Delancey, Rufus King, Robert Lennox, Philip Livingston, and Richard Varick. All of those men have streets named after them. So that shows you their importance in New York City. I think Rufus King's house is still existing. Yeah, King Manor. But this was the exclusive one. This was on the water. You would see where it was coming. If the shipments were coming in, they would go straight to the Totine Coffee House. And that's where you would do all of your trading and your selling. And again, it becomes the cornerstone to the New York Stock Exchange when they finally like move out and build their own building separate from this. This was long-standing as well. I don't remember when it closed, but it was really interesting. And then in addition, New York was a really big importer of coffee because it was one of the main travel ports. So I was able to go in and look for newspaper advertisements because of it's one of my favorite things to do. So John Rooney in the 1780s was a major coffee transporter. So I found one of the advertisements that he put out for coffee as well, of all the things that he was selling: spirits, rum, brandy, shrub, wines, sugars, teas, coffee, chocolate, etc., etc. The one on the right really makes me laugh because it sells elephant teeth, and I was trying to figure out why it was such a large variety of things. And it's 1758, so you're still very much in the early kind of getting to start coffee trade in New York City. It's really starting to come in at a steady pace. And then I remembered where the coffee would have been coming from, because elephant teeth are not native to the United States or Europe. So I took me a second to realize that as they were bringing in all of these goods, they were just collecting along the way as far away from the United States as possible before they were coming back in with all of these goods. But I mean, I couldn't imagine. I was trying to imagine Water Street, Pearl Street, Broad Street, the ships coming off the wharves and them unloading all of this cargo, and the noise and the yelling and the trading that was going on. And it really does make me, there's times where I wish I was around. There's a few times where I wish that like I could just hang out by the harbor for a couple of days and like really see it and like see the fresh markets and stuff. I would have loved to have seen somebody been like, what is an elephant tooth? Because I'm picturing like a huge tusk. And I've seen elephants in real life because of the zoo, but I don't know. There's just something about coffee and sugar coming off of a ship and then selling an elephant tooth. But I mean, it just goes to show you how diverse the economy was in New York City, and that you really could, much like today, get anything you wanted if you tried hard enough and like waited for the right ship. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Do you want to share anything about Timothy Keeler? Because I know you finally found it.
Yeah. So I was trying to find out because, as far as I know, there were no coffee houses in Ridgefield. I don't think we were big enough for that to justify that. But as I did find out, a lot of coffee houses basically turned into taverns, as much as the proprietors of coffee houses, even in these big cities, wanted them to be like these establishments of high intellect. Um, Apparently, this happened a lot, especially in Philadelphia. The Philadelphians did not really go for coffee houses. Um, so a lot of coffee houses, both in the colonies and in London, eventually just kind of turn into taverns anyway. And so I we don't have any record from the tavern itself that shows that Timothy was serving coffee to patrons at the tavern. But because Timothy did also have a general store, I and we have the ledgers for that, I wanted to see, were people buying coffee? Were Ridgefield people buying coffee to then make at home? Because I do feel like if Timothy's selling coffee in his store, it's not that huge of a leap to infer that he's probably serving it as well.
Mhm.
So I looked, and There are very, very few coffee entries, but I found them.
This is big news.
Yes,
Catherine spent a week looking for these. She's very proud of them.
I am. So there are 4 people who bought coffee from Timothy Keeler, in
Oh,
all of the 4 people that I found.
okay.
Most of them bought coffee once. There's one person, and I'll show you his entries afterwards, who I guess liked coffee a lot more than anyone else in Ridgefield. Um, so we have these 3, and these entries all are from 1788 and 1789. Um, and so these people, they're buying anywhere from half a pound to 2 pounds of coffee. And you can see, and one of the things I did notice is coffee is about half as expensive as tea at this time. That was also one thing that helped coffee gain popularity during the tea boycotts,
Mhm.
because it's coming from South America. It's easier to get to um, the colonies than getting it from Africa. Um, but uh, so the cheapness of coffee did help with that. So here we have 2 or 3 of our coffee drinkers in Ridgefield, and then this guy Nathan Chambers. He's the one who buys the most. He buys small quantities of coffee, but he bought it several times. So once in May of 1788, he buys coffee, and it's small, so you can't really see it. He buys about half a pound of coffee here. And then in January of 1789, he buys another half pound of or quarter pound of coffee. And then in July of 89, he buys another half pound of coffee. And so you can see in 1789, a half pound of coffee cost 1 shilling. Um,
Not bad.
tea at the same time cost 3 shillings 10 pence. Um,
Ooh.
yeah, so 3 shillings 10 pence a pound. So
And
it's definitely almost double what the coffee cost.
and this is whole bean coffee, right? Correct? Roasted,
I'm
or is it the
assuming,
green?
yeah, as far as I know, you're basically everybody's buying green coffee that they're going to roast at home. I do know there were some trade roasters who roasted for coffee houses in the big cities. Um,
Mhm.
and but otherwise, if you're buying for your personal, you know, consumption, you're going to roast it yourself. So at least here we know Timothy's got coffee in stock, so he could be serving it at the tavern.
Must have
Um,
been. I refuse to believe the people of Ridgefield were not drinking coffee.
exactly.
They
Um,
were patriots.
yeah, I do. I looked also through the bills of sale that we have of Timothy, where he's going to New York City
Ooh.
to find coffee. Or to buy his inventory. I didn't find any in there, but in the flyleaf of one of his ledgers, he has this page, um, which the the debit side is all about driving a stagecoach.
Mhm.
um, this is from about 1803, which is interesting to me. I don't know why he would be paying um, people to drive stagecoaches, but why that would show up in the ledgers. But the credit side of the ledger shows that debts are being paid in coffee by this company. It's called Edward Ely and White's. Yeah, Edward Ely and White's. And so there's several times in 1803 and 1804 where they're paying off debts with coffee, and they call it 3 pound paper of coffee, um, which is something I would like to look more into. Like, what does a 3 pound paper of coffee mean? I do know like papers of tobacco were just the way they were packaged in like these
Mhm.
paper envelopes. So maybe that's, but 3 pounds, like a 3 pound envelope of coffee seems a lot, but I don't
A
know.
big bag.
So I found this this afternoon. So this is something I'll have to look more into. Um, But there's the proof. Coffee was in Ridgefield.
We did it. Catherine found it. I can't even take any credit for it. As we round out our evening of coffee and stuff, if anybody has any last questions, please leave them in the chat. I'm very proud of this one. I did not have to go search as far as Catherine. I did find an advertisement for Red Diamond Coffee that I'd like to play for everybody, because I did my annual kind of look for advertisements of how things were sold and marketed. And I saw a lot of really sexist advertisements from the 1960s and 70s of women making their husbands coffee, and I really didn't feel like showing those. But I did find this, and this is from Jim Henson using Muppets who sell coffee. So, oops, let's see.
Why are we climbing this
Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay.
tree? For Red Diamond coffee. I don't want any. Oops. It's autumn and the nuts are beginning to fall. Red Diamond makes good coffee. Oop. Better coffee. Oh, Red Diamond makes the best coffee. Congratulations. You want a cup of this coffee? It's Red Diamond coffee. No, give me brand X. Okay. Ooh, that smarts. Old man Donovan just hired me to sell his crummy Red Diamond coffee. Ooh, whoa, whoa, whoa. I think he just fired you, too. Want some Red Diamond coffee before you jump? No. You miss a lot when you don't drink Red Diamond coffee. Let's go up to the surface for a cup of Red Diamond coffee. I never touch the stuff. You should. It's a whale of a coffee.
So that's my favorite thing that I found. It's Jim Henson using Muppets to sell coffee is like where I wish advertising was today. Like if Miss Piggy came on my screen and was like, you should buy this, I would buy it. Or like the Swedish Chef or somebody. But wholesome, quality. One of them does look like a coffee bean. It's very smart advertising. There was the one where he kind of X's him with the hot tassel thing, and that was meant to mimic the cowboy coffee culture, as everybody started to head west for the gold rush, and cowboys loving their like hot, very dark black, very strong cups of coffee. So they were pulling on historical coffee references to make those. But I think my favorite one is the Under the Sea one. I don't know what that says about me. If anybody has any last questions before we leave you tonight, I think we covered a good amount of coffee history. I think we did it today.
Yeah.
I was very excited about this one.
Yeah. There was a lot out there, and there's been a lot of, if anyone's interested, there's been a lot of books in the last I want to say 10 years about coffee and coffee history. And I think one of the things that historians are starting to focus on is the labor aspect of it and who was cultivating and harvesting the coffee and the legacy of that today in the coffee industry as well, because there's still a lot of that
exploitation.
Yes. Especially in Central America and Africa and all that. So so if anyone's there's plenty of resources out there.
Look for the fair trade mark on your coffee the next time you look, because that helps ever so slightly some of that exploitation going on in coffee cultivation. I will say that has started to help.
Yeah. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us for another great taproom tasting. We will be back in January, January 10th, I believe, the second Tuesday in the month. And we will be talking about indigenous foodways and their legacy in New England. And we will have a guest speaker with us as well. So I hope everyone joins us for that. Have a great holiday. and Happy New
Happy
Year.
New Year. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. We won't see everybody till next year.
Yeah. So we'll see everyone in 2023.